Okay, we start with the planted questions. For our friends online, we have a planted question from some Japanese journalist. Where is the mic? No.
You have said that the ego is an object which can be perceived. On the other hand, how would you describe our true nature?
If you are reading it, it doesn't look spontaneous. Yeah. You should have at least digested it and made it your own question.
Okay. It's tough, I mean.
Do you have anything to add to the, is it your question?
Yeah.
So.
Sort of. First, is it true that you have said that the ego is an object which can be perceived?
I must have said that at some point.
Do you still believe it's true?
Well, if we are serious, it depends on what we mean by ego. Okay, ego comes from a Latin word that just means I. So ego is I. Now, if we are in ignorance, we believe that this I is an object, a human body mind, which is an object. In wisdom, the true I, the true ego, is the reality that which is the reality which is hearing these words right now and reading them in Japanese for our friends on the piece of paper. And so it depends on how we define the ego. In spiritual circles, often what is meant by ego is something else. What is meant by ego is ignorance. What is meant by ego is the belief that we are a separate entity. For instance, even in common parlance, if we say, this guy has a big ego, what we mean is that he truly believes to be this separate person. This belief is very firmly established in him or her, and he projects that in his relationship with his fellow human beings, and as a result there is an unpleasantness associated with that. We don't like big egos. Hitler and Stalin were big egos. They are not likable guys. So that the confusion that arises then, when we use the word ego in this spiritual version, instead of the word ignorance, we kind of validate the existence. I mean, it's at 5:30 normally. We kind of validate the existence of such a separate entity. And And it perpetuates ignorance, in fact. So what's the...
Then the second part of the question, how would you describe our true nature?
Yes, our true nature is our real ego, in fact, and it is the reality of that which we are. And the reality of that which we are is that, in the first place, which perceives. That it is a consciousness, the awareness in us. In ignorance, we believe that this awareness is dependent upon the body-mind, that it is somehow a function of a physical or of a subtle entity, a physical entity, a brain, a body, a subtle entity, a mind, a soul. And that this separate entity, this object, is conditioned by space and time, or just by time, therefore that it has a beginning and an end in time, that it is going to disappear. As a result, we experience existential fear, which is a fear of absolute disappearance. This fear, in turn, gives birth to all kinds of ancillary fears that seem to have a particular objects that they are afraid of: fear of elevators, fear of not being loved, fear of being abandoned, fear of the ghosts, fear of the afterlife, if I don't behave like a good boy or a good girl, etc. But all these fears, what they have in common, in fact, is this basic fundamental fear, which is itself a direct effect of ignorance.
Thank you.
Yes, try to be in time because we are webcasting, we cannot wait for you. We have a fixed time to begin, and then it's disruptive if you come later. It's okay to be in advance, to be early.
Francis, is there something that I can do, the way I can change the relationship with my ego, that will help me to realize my true nature?
It depends, as I've just said, what we mean by ego. If for us, ego is a synonym of ignorance, meaning something that we have to liberate ourselves from. It is very important to understand that which we have to liberate ourselves from is not from a formidable, separate entity that has real existence and that therefore would have to cease to exist, to be killed somehow, for awakening to take place. That would be a total misunderstanding of the situation. We are already pure, perfect, eternal awareness of presence. We are fully equipped for happiness. There is nothing really that needs to be fundamentally changed or transformed. All that needs to be done is to stop believing that we are a separate consciousness, that consciousness is somehow limited, dependent upon the body-mind, conditioned by space and time. And the way to liberate ourselves from this belief is to investigate the truth of this belief, to investigate whatever evidence we seem to have that consciousness, that which we are, is separate and limited. Now, the evidence that we seem to have will vary from individual to individual. It will be different depending upon the culture, the past history, etc.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking the question.
Hi, Francis. I like to use the word ignorance instead of ego. Is ignorance an obstacle for awakening? And that I understand it is an obstacle. I understand that it is an obstacle, but I am more interested in the second part of the question, which is ignorance something which is necessary in order to live within a physical body? What I mean, maybe a little bit of it.
Regarding the first part of your question, is ignorance an obstacle to awakening? Now, let me translate it using an analogy. If the belief in Santa Claus an obstacle to the understanding of the true nature of Santa Claus? Is the belief in Santa Claus an impediment? Yes, it is a major impediment. It is in fact the only impediment.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
What was the second part of the question?
The second part is it necessary to have a little bit of ignorance to live a physical body?
Okay. Now, is it necessary to believe a little bit in Santa Claus in order to liberate oneself from the belief in Santa Claus?
No.
Right. So here you go.
Wow,
the only problem is that they are asking me to do 1,500 words with my 6 answers. So far we have done 300 words. So next question.
Number 4.
I will have to add some powdered sugar into the Coke.
Francis, I experience a lot of understanding about the true nature of who we are. However, there are experiences and situations that I may come from ignorance in my reactive pattern or reacting to a situation that clearly comes from ignorance. So my question is, how should we deal with that ignorance when it appears through a trigger or through a certain situation or in a relationship?
The first thing to do is to disown it. Because if we believe to own ignorance, which means to be an ignorant person, we are piling up ignorance on top of pre-existing ignorance, because ignorance is precisely the belief to be a person. So what is important is to disown it as a separate individual, is to place ignorance or the responsibility for ignorance at the feet of God where it belongs, because it's God's creation in the first place. So ignorance should be seen as a meteorological phenomenon, some kind of recurrent meteorological, a natural phenomenon. So there is nothing special about it. And certainly we, as separate individuals, since we have no power on our own, we don't have the power to create ignorance, because we are just puppets in God's hands, right? Therefore, a puppet cannot create ignorance, get rid of ignorance, or even be ignorant. The puppet is just a puppet. So we are, as separate individuals, we are perfectly devoid of ignorance. And as consciousness, it's a game we have decided to play. Fundamentally, we are devoid of it, but because of our universal powers, the moment we decide to play this game, to create all the tools that are necessary, including a human body, to incarnate it, then we are stuck with it. We join the party for the ride, so to speak, or whatever, the trip for the journey for the ride, and we have the possibility to get off the train at any station. Every time the train stops. Every time the train of thoughts, the train of perception thoughts stops. In this interval, we can recover our freedom. In a moment of understanding, in a moment of love, we can go back to our true nature, recognize it, and eventually get knowingly established in it. But even that is a faulty description of the experience, since there is nobody to get established in his true nature, either abruptly, suddenly, or gradually. It's all the display of divine energy, that's all. Thank you. You did a great job. It sounded almost spontaneous, but not quite. Yeah.
Hi, Francis. I'm curious as to what it's like after realization when one has seen through the false ego.
There are two steps. There is one step that we could call awakening, and another step that we could call full realization, or getting established in this rediscovery of our true nature. And that's the end game. And the end game is to be established in peace and happiness. That's the end game. It's all about happiness. A realization that doesn't lead to happiness has no value, in fact, because happiness is that which all human beings seek. In that sense, that's the goal of life, that's a mission. It is wired in us, this desire for happiness. That's what we seek. And happiness is another name for God, or reality. So the seeking reality and finding reality is the mission. And it is synonym to finding happiness, unalloyed, causeless happiness. So that's the end game. That's the end of the path. And on the other end of the path, that's the entry point. It could also be called the initiation. Up until that happens, we are not yet on the path. We are on the path to the path. And the initiation is the revelation of the universality and eternity of consciousness, of that which we are, of our true nature. In other words, it is in fact the revelation of our true nature. That's seen or described from the vantage point of an individual body-mind, of course. In fact, our true nature never reveals itself to an individual body-mind. It reveals only to itself, directly. Between these 2 points is what is called the sadhana, the real spiritual journey, which is the dealing with the leftovers of ignorance. And that's that which we are interested in, and that's a clear distinction between the traditional teachings of non-duality in various forms, being Chan or Zen Buddhism, being Sufism, be it Advaita, Vedanta, and other tradition, in which there is this distinction is made between awakening, the entering the path, and the end of the path. In fact, the end of the path itself is not the real end, because it's an endless process, so to speak. It's just at some point, as we travel on the path, we have left misery behind us. And therefore, all that remains is peace and happiness. But the revelation goes on, keeps going on. In other words, the path becomes more and more beautiful. So the signs that we are on the path, for instance, among other signs, most human beings, as they age, as they get older, they feel that their life is behind them. And they become more sad. And there is a form of resignation and despair, in fact. Whereas for those who are on the path, their experience is that life becomes sweeter and sweeter, better and better. So that's the difference. They know at some point that they have found the right direction, the right orientation. They know it. Their heart tells them that, and also their intelligence and their sense of beauty concur. So these are the symptoms that we are on the path. Another symptom that we are on the path would be that when we think of ourselves, not superficially, of course, if a cop asks you, what's your name? You're not going to tell the cop, I am the Buddha, or something like that. But if you deeply think about what you are, you find nothing in terms of separation, nothing in terms of object. You know, you have discovered, and you have accepted to be both nothing and everything, but not something. So that's also a sign that you have caught the virus and that you are on the path. There are many more signs. Another sign is that a great transformation takes place in your life in an accelerated way. That you may have been stagnant for many, many years, and all of a sudden you discover that you have changed tremendously. That everything has been affected by the change. All your belief system, all the compartments in your life, your professional life, your relationships, your relationships with your family, with your children, with your companion, with your parents, with your co-worker, with your customers, with your employees, whatever, with your work, with your future, your ambitions, your fears. All of that recedes back into the distance. It becomes less important, and the oppositions find an harmonious resolution. And that which comes to the foreground is this peace and this presence that seem to envelop everything.
It's such a miracle that it happens seemingly without any effort or intention.
It can only happen effortlessly because the experience of our true nature is effortlessness itself. How could more effort take us to this effortlessness? At some point it is the surrender of all effort. There are certain paths, because all human beings, most of them, in ignorance, we are toiling, we are efforting. Right?
Indeed.
And sometimes what happens, there are spiritual paths in which all this effort that was usually oriented towards the acquisition of object or the actualization of some events that were deemed to be happiness generators. All these efforts are gathered into a different direction, which is a spiritual direction, but still there is efforting. So it may seem at some point that we are making more effort in this new unknown direction, but it is not until this residual, gathered, concentrated, focused effort collapses in this utter effortlessness of our true nature. It is not until that moment that we really enter the path.
That's like the admonition about the lilies of the field, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. It's very beautiful. Thank you.
Okay, we are through with the planted questions. One more. Okay. That we can get serious at last.
In the Zen stories, this initial awakening is often or always portrayed as a very sudden, spectacular event. So the question is, must it be that, or can there be a gradual softening of the edges towards this awareness?
If we think about how understanding takes place, understanding is always a sudden event. Understanding is not gradual. Now, in hindsight, a series of understandings may be construed as being a gradual evolution. But each of these incremental understandings is in and by itself sudden. Now, there are two types of understandings. There are understandings that precede this entry, this point of entry onto the path. These understandings are essentially about that which we are not. They reveal every time a mistake we were making, a belief system we held about our true nature, about what we truly are. At some point, there is the revelation of what we truly are, at least the revelation of its, as I said earlier, of its universality and of its eternity, of its timelessness. At which point, this sense of impending doom, of absolute disappearance, somehow leaves us. Perhaps some residues, some leftovers remain with us for some time, but the foundation of this belief is gone. So that's the entry on the path, and that's a sudden event. Now, this sudden event sometimes may be very noticeable, but it may also well be that it will be left unnoticed by the mind. It's like when you catch a virus. Sometimes people die because they have caught a virus. Now, they don't remember when they caught it, and then they die. Now, other people, they die in a car accident, so that I'm not sure they notice it, but there is simultaneity between the cause of death and the death. There is no delay, right? So you may have both cases regarding this very important glimpse of truth. That in certain cases, it creates in the mind such havoc, such a big sudden change that it gets noticed. Whereas there are cases in which it is left unnoticed. And it is also possible, if we are very open to all possibilities, that an unnoticed event or non-event of this kind leads down the road to one which is this time well noticed, although the job has already been accomplished subreptitiously. But then the next event, which is a magnitude 8 earthquake, gets noticed, and then it is seen in hindsight as being the first glimpse, whereas in fact it wasn't. Therefore, we shouldn't be really focused on the question, did I have the glimpse or not? Did I have the Satori? For two reasons, because the one who is wandering is a separate entity who couldn't possibly have had the Satori. That's the first good reason. And the second is that Satori is not important, it's overrated. That which matters is happiness, which is the end game. So we should be focused on the end game, on the final destination, rather than on this intermediary turning point on the path.
So, for example, today, when you were pointing at the vegetables in the soup, the Hatha yoga vegetables, and to see that that is the case, is that an example of suddenness or gradualness?
It depends. We have to understand what was being explored during these exercises. that which was really explored is not consciousness itself, but rather the mechanisms in the mind, the patterns in the mind that seem to artificially create a separation between body and world. Now, as we investigate these patterns, if the glimpse has not taken place, this shift, this important glimpse, this investigation will be instrumental in removing some roadblocks and perhaps lead to the glimpse. But the signature of the glimpse is really one of finality and of understanding about what we truly are in our eternity and universality. In these exercises, what we do is we cooperate with the transformation of the mind patterns, of the brain and body patterns that were previously consistent with us being a separate consciousness, and we try to dissolve them and to replace them with new patterns that would be consistent with consciousness being universal. So what happens is that one of the ways we have to change these patterns is just to keep in mind the new pattern. And by keeping in mind the new pattern, the old pattern gets erased, but the new pattern is hardly ever the real pattern, the perfect pattern. However, it is much closer to the natural, spontaneous, Adamic perception of the body. So that what may happen if we bring this pattern close enough to it, it's like if you bring an iron nail close to a magnet on a plane horizontal surface. If it comes close enough, at some point, ploop, it gets attracted by the magnet and sticks to it. And it's the same here. If the new pattern that you artificially create, it's like bringing the nail closer to the magnet. But you can never, using this artificial pattern, little artificial method of visualization, etc., bring it right to the magnet. But you can bring it close enough that at some point the magnet will do the final job. So but I think this explanation is not, it's not contained in the question from this gentleman, but that's good. Thank you.